Welcome. The webinar will start in just a little bit. Thank you. Hello and welcome. This is Mark Diamond from Contoro. Welcome to the second course of our six-part course of study for the in-house practitioner Introduction to Information Governance series. Today we're going to talk about modern records and information management, and we're going to really cover about we're talking about records management. We're going to talk about the RIM component, and that's the acronym sometimes people use for records and information management. Maybe you've heard that term RIM. And how does that fit into an information governance program, which is interesting because a lot of organizations, they've had records programs for years. And oftentimes we see organizations evolving their records management program into an information governance program. But today we want to make sure we get good coverage of not only what is a records management program, but more important, what do we see as a modern records management program? How are people updating or managing the program? What's different than maybe what they did 10 years ago? And how are those things, if done well, do they fit into a records program? And speaking today, for some of you, a long time no talk, Tom Mihle. Tom is an attorney, Vice President Delivery for Control Services, spends a heck of a lot of his week helping a number of companies build and develop not only records retention policies and schedules, but execute those records programs as well as build information governance. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Mark, and hi, everybody.
And again, we're gonna try and make this a little bit more of a conversational pace. We want to make sure that we give everybody the chance to ask questions as we go through, and if you have comments or other things like this, again, our goal is to make this more of a class. What we hope to be able today is really talk about what a RIM program does, talk about some of the differences. How is a policy different than schedule? Because oftentimes those terms are used interchangeably and those are different. And then go into, as what we alluded to, what are some of the differences between an old-fashioned program versus a modern program? And matter of fact, if you haven't changed your program in the last 5 or 10 years, chances are, just because the rest of the world have changed, that you have an old-fashioned program. And again, what types of compliance programs make good value for good records programs? And we'll talk a little bit about those. And so Tom, why don't you sort of start us out? We talk about this thing called Records and Information Management, or RIM. What the heck is it? I mean, we all sort of kind of know, but sometimes it's good just to go back and revisit the basics. Let's start with the basics. What's RIM?
Well, I think you're right. This is what I would think to be sort of the basic idea of what records and information management is. And it's actually a pretty straightforward concept. RIM refers to really the life cycle of information. You or the folks you work with are probably already following this life cycle to a certain extent anyway, in the way that you're working with records every day. But it probably is more complicated than this, but I'd like to look at it in 4 kind of phases of an information life cycle. First, you create information. Make sense? Whether you're creating a Word document or Excel spreadsheet, whether you're drafting an email, whether you're adding some data to a database, all of that creates information. That's the beginning of the life cycle. Much of that information you're going to need to use either immediately over a period of time. Probably you're going to need to use it more in the short term and less in the long term. That means that when you're using it, you'll need to have good access to it. You'll need to know where it's filed in a place where you can find and get to it easily. So that's part of what records and information management deals with, is making sure that you can use it in a way that makes you productive. You'll need to maintain that information. So it's not just about using, it's maintaining it. In the near term, that certainly means keeping it close so you and your team have access to it while it's still active. But you may also need to maintain that record after it's no longer useful to you. If you need to keep it for a certain period of time for legal or regulatory reasons, even though its business use may have decreased for you. That's why we see boxes of paper going off to storage. That's why we see electronic information being stored in archives, because we need to find a way to securely maintain that information so that if you need to access it, you can. It's not a big deal if you have to wait a little bit to get to it. So it's stored and in a place so that it's ready for the next and the last part of the life cycle, which is disposing of the information. Once it has served its useful purpose, either a business purpose or for legal reasons, and it has expired, best practice requires that it be destroyed. Having a defensible process in place for disposing of information when you no longer need it is really a critical last part of the life cycle and of a RIM program in general. When we develop a program, when you develop one or take a look at what you have, you need to make sure you're building it around this life cycle. And I think for the remainder of this session, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the life cycle and learn about records and the differences between the types of records that get kept as part of the RIM life cycle. Next slide. So to understand how to properly manage records, we think it's helpful first to know what is a record? What's not a record? It is always interesting to me when I visit at organizations where employees think they know, but are not real sure. What's a record? What's not a record? What do we need to keep? What can we get rid of? Once you understand that, it becomes a much more straightforward process figuring out how to manage both records and non-records. So what does a record constitute? This is the characteristics that we usually find in a record that is something that needs to be kept by the organization. One, it reflects business action or decision. That makes sense? That's pretty clear that a business record needs to reflect actions or decisions of the company. Two, it can be in any media format. It can be paper, it can be electronic. We've said this many times before. At Nike, shoes can be records. At a big pharma, a tissue sample can be a record. The format doesn't matter. The content of whatever it is what determines whether it's a record or a non-record. Likewise, I'm going to hop down one bullet point below that and say it can be in different locations. It can be in physical or virtual locations. It doesn't matter where it's stored. It can be on-site, off-site, in the cloud, on premises. It can be anywhere. It has, and then finally, really, its retention is justified by one of 3 things. Either there are really 2 things: legal or regulatory requirements. There are specific citations or laws that mandate that records be kept for a certain period of time. Or 2, that the record has some level of business value to keep it. So there may be that there's a record that the law doesn't care how long you keep that record, but to get our business done and to be productive and to be a successful company, we need to keep it for a certain period of time. So the way I like to look at this in general is a document is a record if 1, it concerns the business, and 2, it is required to be kept by the retention schedule. That's sort of a quick way of boiling it down is if it's required to be kept as a record, either for business or legal reasons, and 2, it concerns the business, then good chance is that will be a record.
Now, Tom, we get this issue sometimes that people sometimes want to use their policy as a bit of a big stick, if you will, saying, "Oh, we've declared that's not a record, therefore you don't need to keep it." Or, we see a lot of organizations, what they really want are defensible disposition strategies, and they drive it by only declaring what's an official record and saying everything else we can delete. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that when you define certain things only as official records and everything else as not, then you run into trouble unless you're defining it correctly. The challenge that we find is that in most cases, companies don't always get to decide what is a record and what isn't. Sometimes the law gets to decide. There are a number of organizations that, for example, will say email is not a record. We do not consider that any emails are records. And to a certain extent, we're talking semantics here. That's possibly true. An email itself really is a means of communication, but the information inside the email, the attachment or the content of the email itself, could very well be a record. We find that when organizations kind of make blanket statements like this, they run the risk of actually ignoring records and missing places where records can be that do need to be kept for a certain period of time.
Well, and the other point, and I think this is an unsung role of a lot of records managers, and you alluded to this, is the business value of a records program. Is sometimes people only want to focus on the legal regulatory, and as you said, there's certain business value associated with records. To what extent is the role of a records manager understanding what information is valuable to the business?
Well, you've just said it. I think that a good records manager is going to understand not only what the requirements are for certain records, but the fact that when we work on retention schedules for organizations, we find, I would argue that 50 to 60% of the records in a schedule really don't have legal retention requirements, but are nevertheless important to the organization and have some level of business value. So, and being able to tell this is something that the business needs. But you've got to justify it. You can't just take their word for it and say we need to keep this forever for business value. There's more of an exercise to go through it if somebody says this is a record that we need to keep. But there's no question that the majority of records that an organization has, it needs to be retained more for business value than for the fact that there might be a legal requirement for it. So it's really important that you make this definition of records for your organization and that you put that definition into a policy. What you see here is just a sample from somebody's records retention policy. It describes records at the top and that there are retention requirements for them, but it also describes non-records. This particular policy calls that disposable information, but read non-records for that. And it also says if there are no retention requirements for these types of documents. We think that it's really necessary to say both. So many policies just talk about records that they don't give employees enough understanding about what's not a record, because there's a whole lot of stuff that people are holding on to because they don't know the difference. We see it so many organizations that employees don't have a clear understanding of that difference. And once you understand that, one, non-records can be destroyed whenever you don't need them, and two, we all have a whole lot of what would turn out to be non-records, it becomes a lot easier to manage records. It becomes a lot more freeing to employees when they understand, hey, we've got a lot of stuff here that we've been hanging on because we don't know any better. And frankly, I think it makes it a lot easier for them to make decisions on what they need to keep. That's why we think that putting both of these into a policy is really important. But I think we probably should talk a little bit more about non-records and kind of define those a little bit further. Can we go to the next slide?
This is a good question that comes up, Tom. Is we talk about people talk about and people do records and schedules, and clearly some of them have high business value, and some of them have legal or regulatory requirements for retention. But there's some that people just say, hey, I need this, I want this, even though we don't have to keep on to it, and it's not really business value for the organization. You talk about this term here, working documents. How does that cover it?
Right. So there are documents that we all work on during the day or create at some point in time while we're working that they don't constitute records. They wouldn't be found in your retention schedule. They're not exactly non-records because you still need them to do your job. That's why we like to think of a middle category, and the middle category we call working documents. They are that you probably all have them. You're working on a task or a project. You create some notes, maybe an outline of what you plan to do. You might gather some reference materials from the internet to do some research. All of these would be working files. And once that task is over, most of those working files are no longer needed, right? There might be some documents that actually become part of an official record once you're done. So there might be something that you're working on actually becomes a record, but that retention period will be listed somewhere in your retention schedule. But we find that the vast majority of working files can really be disposed of once that task is complete. Now, most companies that have mature records and information programs recognize that people are going to have sort of this middle ground between records and non-records, and that working files are necessary to people being able to get their jobs done. It has a value to them, but it's more of a short-term value. And so usually they put some type of short retention period on working files. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's 2 years, which is usually way more than enough time to complete a job or a task or something, but it's not so long that it's keeping records forever. In a scheme of a general retention schedule, it's not a very long period of time, but at least it gives employees the comfort that they can keep the documents they need to do their everyday work for at least a year or two, so that allows them to be productive and actually get stuff done. Next slide. So when we talk about real non-records, there are 4 different categories that we talk about. And frankly, we've got listed here work papers as number 3. Work papers and working files, I would argue there's not a tremendous difference to them. There are some work papers that you can get rid of as soon as the task is over. How you choose to handle those between records or non-records and working files is kind of a determination you'll want to make on your own. The main categories of non-records that we find in organizations by far are the top 2: convenience copies and drafts. A convenience copy, clearly, obviously, you're familiar with it. It's something you get by email. You're copied on it. It's probably not a record. If there's an attachment to it, it's not a record that your department owns or manages or created, but you're being copied as a convenience. The general rule is you are under no obligation to keep that. As soon as you no longer need it, you may just dispose of it at that moment. In no event should you keep it longer than the retention period for that document. Because it is a convenience copy, you need to at a minimum stick by the retention period that exists. We would argue that most convenience copies are being kept for reference purposes rather than for actual usage purposes, and I would make the argument that very few convenience copies really have a lot of use and can probably be destroyed if you really think about it. The other type of non-record that we want to think about is the draft. Now, certain types of drafts do need to be kept for a period of time. For example, legal would need to keep drafts of a contract, multiple drafts, to be able to go back and say, what were we thinking when we were negotiating this contract? For legal reasons, it might be important that those drafts be kept. Likewise, there might be other types of documents within your organization where the drafts have a significance that you would need to keep them. But let's say that you're just giving a monthly financial report and you've gone through 4 drafts of a PowerPoint presentation. You don't need to keep the first 3 drafts. And in general, the rule with drafts are once that either new version or the final version is in place, then all the drafts can go away. And again, like convenience copies, I'd argue that there are a lot more drafts out there than really need to be. And I'm always surprised why, because most of the time you don't really need to keep those other drafts. Like I said, there are exceptions. Sometimes you might need to keep it, but in most cases you would not.
So, Tom, what about the situation where, for example, somebody is negotiating a contract with somebody else, and originally they want something, and then they later decided to delete it from the contract? From a records management perspective, are you saying they wouldn't keep the drafts, or they would keep the drafts?
No, like I said, in many cases and in most cases, when you're negotiating something with legal significance like a contract, legal certainly is going to want to keep the drafts of those contracts, because you want to be able to go back and say, oh no, in this draft you said this, but in this draft we said X and Y and versus A and B. There will be certain circumstances on which the draft will have some level of legal significance, and that's going to be a business decision that you'll have to make when you're putting together your retention schedule and your policy to determine what when you determine what constitutes a draft that needs to be kept versus a draft that's just a non-record.
Well, and I guess the point you're just to highlight the point here. You need to make a decision on what you want to do. I mean, there's a decision to be made here.
Right. There is a decision. You need to decide what drafts, and I think the general activity would be: are there records in the organization where drafts are critical to keep? Identify those records, and then generally say every other draft is considered to be a non-record. Here are the exceptions of drafts that would be considered to be records, and as a default, everything else would be a non-record. That's generally how I would approach that.
Okay.
Real quick, just to cover that last non-record at the bottom, and I'll cover it quickly because it is so simple and basic. Transitory information, emails and things that you don't need. We met with an organization where half of their email were menus from food delivery services. Some emails were thanks messages or birthday cake down in the kitchen. Those types of messages don't constitute records at all, period, and they can be deleted immediately. In most cases, personal emails and things like that also considered to be transitory non-record information. Those types of things should be fairly simple to spot. They don't concern the business at all, and so they should not be kept for any period of time. So this sometimes for a lot of organizations is low-hanging fruit to deal with, because it is so easy to determine what's not a record and what is. Next slide. So now that I think we've got an understanding of what is a record and what's not a record, how do we keep track of that? How do we keep track of managing both records and non-records? And that's, there are two key components to this. There's a lot of components of a records and information management program, but we really consider that the foundation will be your records retention policy and or destruction policy and your records retention schedule. Now, the records retention policy is the why. It's an enterprise-wide policy, it should be, that applies not only to all employees, but it applies to contractors, to anyone else who handles your organization's information. If they handle it, they are subject to the policy. A records policy could be long or short. I've seen both, but the best policies really cover three main areas, three main requirements: that the company will, one, maintain its records and information as long as required for legal, regulatory, or business purposes. Two, that once the purposes are served and that the retention periods have expired, that the company will dispose of that information. Really important that be in there. A lot of policies say you should keep records, but all of them say you should dispose of them. So employees don't feel like they have permission to actually get rid of records. And then three, in the event that there is a legal hold, that there is some other legitimate business emergency, that retention schedule would be suspended and relevant records would be preserved until the legal hold is released, or there's some sort of notice from legal that you can then resume normal retention. There are other important parts of a policy, like what are your responsibilities, how do we change the policy, what are the consequences if you don't handle records in compliance with the policy, so forth, those types of what we normally see in most policies. But really, a policy really has to communicate that a company must keep its records for a certain period of time, get rid of those records when the time is up, and hold on to those records in case of litigation or some other legal matter. In contrast, The retention schedule is the what. If the policy is the why, the schedule is the what. What records do we as a company maintain for legal, regulatory, or business purposes, and how long do we need to keep them? Schedules can come in a variety of formats, but we think that the best schedules are really those that keep it simple for the employee. What are the records that need to be kept, and what is the simple retention period for those records? At a minimum, that's really what we think an employee needs to see from their schedule. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes, but at a minimum, that's what a good modern compliance schedule needs to be from a user-facing standpoint.
Now, Tom, you've alluded to the importance of having an up-to-date policy and schedule, and one of the things you've talked about in the past on our webinars is the fact, for example, with GDPR data, you need some justification about saving, if you're going to save any privacy data and be under the European General Data Protection Regulations, European privacy laws, you need to be able to justify that. How does the policy and schedule fit into that? Can you give us a little bit of color on that?
Around privacy data, is that what you said?
Yes, and specifically justifying retention with your schedule.
Right. So, yeah, we get this question quite a bit: is how do we manage retention of privacy-related information? And I'll use GDPR as the primary example. The GDPR really doesn't contain a retention requirement for privacy-related information, but it subscribes to the principle that you might know as the data minimization principle, and it's one of the accepted privacy principles that personal information should be retained only as long as it is needed for the purpose for which it was collected. And so when you are looking at a retention schedule, when you're defining how long you need to keep personal information, you need to come to some conclusion. How long do we need it for the purpose for which we collected it? It may be that for legal reasons, you need to keep it for much longer than you would expect to under GDPR. But I'll give the clearest example for me is a personnel file. An employee leaves a company, and the next day they call up and ask that under the GDPR, or soon to be under the California Consumer Privacy Act, asking that their entire personnel file be deleted immediately. Well, for legal reasons, most companies can't just delete a personnel file immediately. They have to hold it for a period of time to satisfy any applicable employment-related statutes of limitations. So it's hard for them to say that. So being able to show here is the purpose for which we are keeping this record will be part of what an organization needs to decide when they're figuring out how does retention of privacy data affect or influence the putting together of our retention schedule in general.
So to summarize that, Tom, a policy and schedule justifies the fact that we need to keep some of this data, and if you have an out-of-date policy and schedule, you could be in trouble because you don't have any justification for keeping data, which could be in contrast. I mean, the privacy laws allow you to keep data if you have to, but the policy and the schedule is this says I have to. Is that correct?
That's right. I think that having an out-of-date policy and schedule will definitely affect your ability to comply with privacy regulations, because you'll definitely need to you'll need to take all of that into consideration when figuring out how you're going to comply with these privacy laws. Now, as part of, like I said with a policy, the third piece of what a records policy needs to have is something around legal holds. And here's an example of information found on a legal hold notice. It is specifically instructing the user to continue to keep records, but not to delete them, not to destroy or alter or do anything to them that might change the record or get rid of it. A legal hold is usually the only thing that will trump your records policy and your retention schedule. Because the penalties can be so high for destruction of company information, it's important that all employees are aware of the rules and follow them. But most important, when it's released, when the legal hold is released, a mature program is going to instruct employees that it's okay to assume regular record-keeping requirements and dispose of any information that might have reached its expiration while the legal hold was in place. We've seen a lot of organizations where they have either not communicated the release of a legal hold, and employees were were holding on to records for much longer than the retention period because of bad communication, or the employees weren't really aware that they could actually start managing the records in compliance with the policy again. So communication between legal and RIM and the user, the employee, is really critical around legal hold, or else you can wind up having much longer term retention of records just through no fault of anything but lack of communication.
Well, or the opposite side of that, we've seen this quite a bit, is companies do sometimes delete emails or files or even texts or other things like that when they should be held and preserved under legal hold. And we've seen organizations not only get sanctions by the court, but lose entire lawsuits just because, regardless of what the merits of the lawsuit, just because they didn't comply with the legal hold. So that's a big deal.
It is a big deal when records get destroyed, and records, I think, more often are destroyed because an organization fails to put a complete legal hold or educate its employees about how to comply with a legal hold. That's why we find that records most frequently get destroyed. I would argue, though, that the danger more with legal hold is that people are holding on to too much, and that results in more information to collect and review. It's a different kind of risk, but I think it's equally as bad for the company and for the lawyers who are having to deal with it.
So you're saying that they get so afraid they save everything forever, and that
Correct.
creates huge problems. A lot of it very expensive when it comes to discovery.
Exactly. It's expensive to collect it. It's expensive, and it's most expensive for a lawyer outside counsel to go through and review all that information. I mean, I think we've made great strides with electronic discovery technology, being able to filter and dedupe and try and get to the records that are relevant. But it's still a lot of work to go through, and it's still a very expensive process.
All right. Now, Tom, we look at this. We talk about this a lot: traditional approaches versus a modern approach. And we started out this webcast by saying that if you haven't changed your records retention program the last 5 or 10 years, the laws have changed. I mean, the environment's changed. What organizations need to do have changed. So chances are, in doing nothing, you may be a traditional or old-fashioned approach versus a modern approach. We've talked about this. Tell us more. What's a traditional program? What's a modern program? What's the differences between the two, and why should they care?
Well, I think that the main thing that's changed over the past 10, 15 years is that the programs back then were primarily paper-based, and even though electronic records have been around for much longer than that, they really haven't taken precedence in the corporate environment until the past 10 or so years, where there's just so much stuff now. And the way that paper was managed before just isn't up to snuff to manage electronic records the same way. It just can't be done the same. So here's an example of some of the traditional versus modern approaches. Obviously, it was biased towards paper records. Now most retention programs are the modern mature programs are comprehensive. They look at record types in all formats, and because of that, they have to evolve and change. Like we've said a couple of times today, in the past, most records programs were focused on legal and regulatory requirements. New and more modern recognize the fact that there's business value in the majority of the records that are kept in the retention schedule, and so it's important to hold on to those as well. Past programs were more dictated by legal or by compliance and saying, here's what you should do. We find that the best modern programs and modern retention schedules represent consensus. The organization has a hand in putting it together. They have a hand in approving it, which helps with compliance. It helps with understanding because they've actually participated in putting that whole retention schedule together. As we'll talk about more, in the past, records was more of a standalone entity. We are seeing more and more that it is being more tightly integrated into a full information governance organization. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then finally, one of the things that we still see today and not happening is when a policy is published, there is still very little audit or monitoring to ensure compliance. And if there is audit and monitoring, they're monitoring the wrong things. They're not really looking at the right way are people really keep information the right way? And so to make a records program and a schedule defensible, it really needs to be it really needs to have some processes and procedures and some type of audit and monitoring to make sure that people are actually following the rules and are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Having talked to a lot of different executives and looking at it, one of the issues we hear a lot of times from records managers is, can I get people to care about my program? You know, I'm not getting the support, the attention, the resources that we need. To some extent, we would summarize it. That's true of the traditional approach. To be honest, you know, a lot of organizations sort of put a checkbox. Traditional approach, yeah, we have a records retention program. We're finding that organizations, however, take more of the modern approach that we're prescribing, not only in this one webinar. Actually, we're talking about the whole modern approach in this entire webinar series. That actually has a lot of value, and we're finding those programs get a lot of traction and get a lot of attention. So one of the things you may want to ask yourself is, if your records retention program isn't getting the attention or the resources you think it deserves, maybe the problem is the approach. Maybe if you took a more modern approach, you may get more effectiveness in terms of your program.
Yep. So there are. Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, so how does this boil down? We've talked a lot about a modern records retention schedule. How is it? What's in a modern records retention schedule? How is it different? We're seeing, and by the way, we're seeing this in a large scale. We're seeing lots and lots of organizations across nearly all industries sort of redoing how they do their records retention schedule to be more modern. But when they're doing it, what are they doing, and how's the actual records retention schedule different if it takes this more modern compliant approach?
Well, I want to actually, I think that's more for the next slide. For this slide, I want to talk about factors that are influencing the need for more modern compliance schedules. There are a lot of forces that are kind of bearing on what companies are doing these days, and how the notion of information is evolving. That's really sort of the driving force behind all this. First of all, more than ever, we have stricter legal and regulatory requirements. The databases that we have with citations in them have well over 60,000 record retention requirements, and that's global. That's both U.S. and global, but it's up significantly from the past few years when we only had 30 to 40,000 citations that were out there. A lot more in the retention requirement arena, a lot more requirements and a lot more strict requirements by the regulators on keeping records. Really, by the switch to electronic media, it's really the volume. It's that we've got records that are now living exclusively alone in multiple copies, in multiple places, that there are new types of devices. We talk about social media, but just the explosion of digital records really demands a new look at how retention schedules are done. We talk about other governance frameworks. We've talked about GDPR, but there are other compliance frameworks that you need to think about, whether it's discovery related, whether it has to do with the federal sentencing guidelines, whether it's HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley. Understanding other governance frameworks and how record retention fits into them is important. And then finally, I think we've talked before about the issues that really are defining what was wrong with the old approaches. Not identifying records of value, low compliance, continued accumulation of information, e-discovery that's a problem because there's just so much stuff to go from, and just general non-compliance in hoarding and keeping records for long periods of time. All of these things combine to say we need a different way of looking at a retention schedule and what the best practices are for that. So, what makes a good retention schedule? I think there are some animations to this, right? So the first one really here is compliance. What are the hallmarks of a good retention schedule? First is retention compliance. Are we following all the rules? Now that should go without saying. Do we make sure that we're following both state, federal, international if we need to? Have we covered all the rules, and are we making sure that our retention periods are at the very least following the most stringent, the longest? Lots of retention requirements out there are 1 or 2 or 3 years, and for business purposes, you will usually find that you want to keep them longer than that. So as long as you're meeting what we would call the high watermarks for regulations, that's where we find that you become compliant with regulations across all jurisdictions. Is it comprehensive? Have you identified all the records? Again, you want to make sure that you're not just thinking about the records that are common, the ones that people automatically think of, but the uncommon records, the records that may only be used by a couple of groups. You want to make sure that it covers every record one way or the other. Again, the next one that goes without saying, have we looked across all media? Do we understand that this applies to paper, electronic, and other formats? Working with an organization recently, they said, well, this really doesn't apply to me because we stopped keeping paper records a long time ago. We only keep electronic. They thought that the record retention schedule only applied to paper records. So it's important that a retention schedule be communicated as applying to all media. Is it clear? Does it? Do we say what is and what is not a record? Do we actually describe the record? And I think part of this is having a policy that describes what is and what isn't a record. But to be able to let people know what they need to keep and what they what they don't need to keep, there needs to be some level of clarity. Again, I mentioned consensus. Consensus is really about, is everyone agreeing? We find that that's usually useful to go and meet with the business, understand what records they keep, then let them look at the schedule before it's published and say, did we hear you? Was this exactly what the records that you keep? That goes a long way to getting people to buy in to the notion of a retention schedule, keeping what needs to be kept for the period of time that's listed in the schedule.
So Tom,
yes.
I'm sorry for interrupting. We have a question on that. So, and we hear this sometimes. And consensus, sometimes people don't save enough, but by and large, the vast majority of organizations we talk to or we see, the concern is that over retention. Everybody saves everything forever and it's hoarding. And there's a fear among some, if we go talk to the business units and talk to the employees on what are we going to keep, they're going to say, no, we just want to keep everything forever. And what's the point? And somebody may say, we don't want a consensus because they're saving too much stuff already. What we want to do is narrow down what they want to do. So if somebody were to challenge you on this consensus point, how would you answer that?
Well, I view the consensus as a negotiation. When we talk to folks, and I usually find that most people tend to be very realistic about the records that they keep. There are certain records that you do need to keep very long periods of time. If you're working in environmental areas, if you're working in pharmaceutical areas, there are certain types of records that you need to keep for a long time, and you need to recognize that. But there are other records that when people say, oh no, we need to keep it indefinitely, then you go back and ask the question, but how long do you actually need to go back and use it? And you usually find if they're being honest with themselves, they'll say, well, we really only go back to that 5 years. I say, so if we compromised and said you could keep it for 7 or 10 years, that's still better than forever. That's still shorter time than forever, but you're at least having some level of compromise and they feel like they've been heard. And so gaining consensus is about not allowing them to do whatever they want to do. It's explaining why they can't do what they want to do, but finding a middle ground that makes everybody happy.
Thank you.
So the next piece is usability. Again, if it's not easy to follow, I've seen a lot of old schedules that use the acronym ACT. I think that acronym is incredibly complicated because it's very flexible, but it depends on the context of the record. We'll see ACT +7 for personnel records, but we'll also see ACT +7 for a contract, and they mean different things. One is when the employee is terminated +7 years, and the other one is when the contract is terminated. Why not just spell it out? Why not just tell people, here's what the trigger is that creates the retention period, and make it easy for people to follow? Don't give them so much detail. Yes, Mark?
Tom, what is ACT for those?
I'm sorry, I was talking so fast. ACT is the acronym that means active, and it's generally used to mean while a record is active, you should keep it, and then there will be a plus a certain number of years after that to let people know how many years after that active time ends. And the trigger, we believe that we should really just spell out the trigger instead of saying ACT. What is the active period? So while an employee is employed, and then when they're terminated, that triggers the retention period. Instead of putting ACT and making people wonder, or in some schedules, I've seen an entire page filled with columns of here's what ACT means for this record, and here's what ACT means for that record. Why not spell it out? Let people know what they're talking about. Integrated. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but a schedule needs to integrate into all parts of your information governance program, your discovery, your privacy data, your information security. It really needs to be part of that to be modern and compliant. Defensible. Everything we've been talking about here is what leads a schedule to be defensible. It has to make sure that you're keeping the information the right amount of time for legal, regulatory, and business requirements, and that it meets all these requirements, these components here, these criteria of a good retention schedule. It needs to be something that if a court took a look at it, if they asked how long are you supposed to keep these records, then they'll say we find that to be reasonable. That's what makes a schedule defensible. And then finally, maintainable. If it's not in a format that you can easily update it, that you can go back to it and revise a retention period or add some citations to it, it really becomes something that becomes more of a chore than actually something that you're okay with working with. So that's more on the back end, but it's equally important, because if you find something that is only in a PDF format you might get from a vendor who does a retention schedule for you and they just give you a PDF, you can't maintain that. You're going to have to build it from scratch on your own. So make sure that it's in a format that you can easily get to and use and change and modify whenever you need to do
that. So we've talked about a schedule, but a schedule in itself does not a program make. What's the difference between a schedule and a program? And for that question, what's in a whole program?
Right, so what you'll see here are what we consider to be the standard components of any records management program. You'll notice that the policy and schedule are number 2 and 3, and they're only 2 and 3 out of about 7 items here. So at the very top of that is going to be some type of records management organization, whether it's a records manager and records coordinators, whether that's some type of steering committee that oversees records management at a high level for the organization. You need someone to enforce the policy. If you send out a policy and schedule, but there's no one to actually tell people how to use it or to make sure people are using it, then what's the use of sending out the policy? You need the standard operating procedures. If the policy is the why and the schedule is the what, then the procedure is the how. How do we keep records this way according to the policy? You'll need to have records for how to deal with the data of departing employees, how to deal with information if you have a merger or an acquisition and you need to control those types of records. How do you conduct a paper cleanup or an electronic document cleanup? Those types of things are important to have, and we usually see those done in procedures. As I mentioned before, if you're not auditing or monitoring, then you're never going to know if your program is successful or if it's actually working. We can't talk enough about change management. In fact, there I think is one of the components of this series. But change management and education is critical to a records program, because if you're not educating people on the importance of this and how to do it right, they're not going to follow it and you won't be successful. And that, along with that, you want to provide the right resources and tools so that people are able to get information on a regular basis on how to comply and what they need to do to make sure that they're properly managing company records.
So Tom, we have a quick question here. Can either of you speak to the concept of abandoned records and how to deal with appropriate disposal? What happens if, for example, an employee leaves, and it may be not just abandoned records, abandoned documents, and some of those documents may be records. How do we sort of handle the abandoned, or how does that fit into a program?
So I think that I think there's two ways to look at it. One way is looking forward. Like I mentioned before, having a procedure for the records of departing employees is a really important thing to do. Once an employee is leaving, whether they've given notice or whether they've been terminated immediately, you need to be able to go in to see where their records are. Did they leave behind information in email that's important? Do they have a personal file share on the network that has information for them? Were they keeping records in a folder that's called Dan that's out there on your departmental file share? figuring out where those records are and making sure that the right people get access to them is important, because in most cases, my guess is your IT department already has plans for their email and their home drives to go away within a certain period of time unless somebody goes and does something. They will usually check in with managers to see if there's any information, but my experience is that management usually doesn't check back, and that information either goes away or just winds up somewhere. The real challenge is in organizations that haven't been doing that, where you have large abandoned cemeteries of departing employee documents out there, and that becomes part of a larger legacy effort. Whether you look at it and you decide, this data has been out there for 10 years and we know that there's nothing over 10 years that we need to keep, then you can maybe take a broad stroke to that and just delete it all. If it's shorter term information, you may have to actually go in there and see what's going on. So really the kind of information, how long it's been there and how much you have is going to decide what you need to do. And some of it can be quite painful if you need to deal with it. Some of it's more relatively easy.
So that brings us to our next point, which this slide highlights, which is what do you do? We even talk about how to actually get records met. We're just switching slides here. Employees, a lot of time, we talked about the compliance issues, we talked about the legal issues, and we've talked about how some really bad things can happen to people and organizations when those. But it's interesting. We find that poor records management really hurts the employees. And people don't think about it that way. People think, oh no, the employees save everything forever and they don't like records management. But Tom, you've talked about this in the past. You don't find that's the case. You find that bad records management helps employees and good records management helps employees.
I think there are always going to be employees who believe that they need to keep everything forever or else they can't do their job. I recall the one employee who said, I saved my company $10 million because I kept that email for 15 years. I'm never getting rid of that email again. You're always going to have people like that, but most people say, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I keep everything because I don't know any better. And what we usually find is that the more stuff it's just logical. The more stuff that people have, the harder it becomes to organize it, the harder it is to find it, the harder it is to find the information of other people. I have many people say, I know how to find my own stuff. I don't know how to find anybody else's. I have to go ask them rather than go out and look for it myself because I'll never find it. It's logical that the better organized your information is and the less of it that you have, the more productive people are going to be. Now, this is a soft cost. This is something that is hard to actually monitor and understand, but it is a tangible benefit on the mental state of your employees, as well as on their productivity. We've seen it happen. We've seen organizations that feel like they've been able to reclaim time to actually get stuff done because they're spending less time looking for information.
All right, Tom, we have another question here. Our current list of available record series is over 900 series long, local government state regs. As we look at retention and disposition for things like relational databases, how do you configure a file plan to support the systems that normally have multiple retention periods? 900 series long, there's your problem. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the question is because there's multiple issues in there that I kind of like to discuss. I think you're right. Having a record retention schedule that's over 900 series long is a potential issue. But I think where you're getting at is relational databases and understanding how to get rid of certain information. That is probably a more complicated exercise than we have to talk about in the last 10 minutes of this presentation. But it really involves understanding the records that you have in that database and understanding the capabilities of the database to be able to apply retention to certain pieces of it. Some don't have that capability. Some only have the ability to wipe everything away at once that's over a certain period of time. That's why we find that applying retention to structured systems tends to be the most complicated and time-consuming activity that you wind up having. There are ways to deal with that. There are ways to take some some of that important information, maybe take it out of a database, put it into a format where you can actually apply time-based retention to a certain subset of those records if you wanted to. But there are ways to deal with it. It requires some planning, some thought, and understanding about how you really need to keep the records within that database.
Well, I guess the other comment we'd make is that at 900, we're seeing a big switch from organizations going from detailed, complex records retention schedules to less, more compact, bigger bucket records retention schedules. And you can still have a more compact records retention schedule that is compliant. In this case, it sounds like state and local that may still meet statutory requirements. Or somebody told you a long time ago, because of statutory requirements, you need to have 900 record types, and we'll probably disagree with that. We'll say that no. And matter of fact, you're actually being non-compliant because you're having this detailed schedule out there that nobody can follow.
Well, and I'd also argue that if, because of that schedule, you have multiple pieces of information in that database that have multiple retention periods, if for some reason you were able to come to an agreement that said, you know what, all the stuff in this database we're going to keep for 10 years, then suddenly your problem is much easier. If you don't have multiple retention periods in there, and you can say, let's err on the side of keeping some of this information a little bit longer, then suddenly your retention issues become a lot clearer.
And we've said this quite a bit. Compliance comes from showing you're following your schedule. Compliance doesn't come from having a detailed schedule. And we think that's one of the big myths. This idea that you need, the more, I get super compliance by having lots of detail. We think that's actually hurt records management as a practice. And that's why we're seeing so many organizations take a different approach, to be a smarter, more modern approach. And we had another question here, which sort of leads into our next slide. How does one resolve the issue of saving and keeping electronic documents in shared drives, and I'll say in shared drives or file shares or other places like that? I mean, this sort of begets a larger process, and that, I guess, brings us into information governance, Tom?
It does. This session has really been about records and information management, which is only part of that broader discipline of information governance. And as you see here, now that you know that you need to keep the information, you know the information that you need to keep, how are you going to store it? How are you going to organize it to make it easy to find, easy to share, and ultimately delete it when the retention period expires? What are you going to do about all that legacy information sitting out there in older systems or on file shares? I'm getting to the question in just a second. How do you bring into compliance how do you bring all of that in compliance with your records policy? Finally, how are you going to make sure people are going to follow all of this? We talked about change management. It's a huge critical part to deal with. Now, to go more specifically to that question, we use the challenge with shared drives is that it's generally dumb storage. It'll keep everything you have forever, but it won't do anything to it. And so the best practice is usually to try and find a place that you can store it that actually can apply search features to it, that can apply retention to it. Sometimes that's an ECM, enterprise content management system. Sometimes it's something like SharePoint. It could be that there are tools that you can apply to a file share that can attempt to make it smarter. Those tend to be retrofitting tools and things like that. But we usually find, and what we're finding more often, is that organizations are actually starting to move away from the notion of the shared drive just because it is so hard to apply retention and to enforce retention against information that happens to be stored there.
And our other comment is stay tuned. This is a topic we will definitely explore more in the series. So you're asking good questions. So real quickly, Tom, records management versus information governance?
So records management, you see on the left, that's the traditional approach. That's the approach that's usually been taken. But if you look on the other side, you understand that information governance applies to everything that touches information in an organization. It includes privacy, how you have to protect the personal information of your customers. It includes litigation readiness and e-discovery, how your organization is able to respond to requests for information in litigation or regulatory matters. It includes information security, making sure that information is being protected according to its sensitivity level. Organizations that are taking an overall information approach tend to be more successful in managing their information. If you're just focusing on records management, you're definitely handling an important piece, but you're also still kind of missing out of that bigger picture.
Okay, thank you. And then just to summarize real quickly, Tom, Carlos has put a very nice picture here. Some of the take-home points.
Yeah, the take-home points here really are True records and information management is applying that policy and process, that training and audit to management of records. You need all of it. Take even one piece out and you're not going to be as successful. We believe that the simplest way to think about your information is dividing it into records, working documents, and non-records. That's going to help you and your employees better understand what to do with each. Your records policy should be universal. It should apply to all records in any format, in any location. The policy should point to a schedule that gives instructions on how long to keep company records and give permission to destroy them when it reaches that retention period. Those best policies and schedules are comprehensive. They're easy to understand and use. They address not just the legal requirements, but also the business value of records. And then finally, it's really not just about records and information management. Organizations are moving towards more overall governance of information, which is really making them more successful as well as more compliant.
So we're about out of time. Just real briefly about Contoral. We are a strategic consulting firm. We don't sell any products, but we help organizations develop not only records retention policies and schedules, we help them execute those, and we obviously help organizations build the larger information governance programs. We work with everybody from federal agencies to state and local to more than 30% of the Fortune 500. Fortunately, I got working for me a bunch of people who are much smarter than me, good people like Tom and other ones like that with tremendously experience on that, and we have programs that have real impact on this. We touched, by the way, we could, any of these topics, we tend to want to talk about these a lot. We don't have time for everything, but fortunately, we have an info pack for that. So we created for the Association Corporate Counsel an info pack on creating a modern, compliant, and easier to execute records retention schedule. Email us and we'll send that back to you. That's a 45-page document that covers a lot of the topics that we did today and goes into that. So email info@contoral.com. We'll be happy to send you that specific document. And the next class is Thursday, October 11th, overview of privacy and data classification. We alluded to data security classification, GDPR. We're going to talk about California data privacy. So we have a lot of stuff coming up in the next class. And then stay with us through the series. We're obviously hitting records management. All these fit together, and the whole series will explore this whole area of information governance. And these recordings are available. So if you missed part of this or you want to replay that, do that. I think we are officially out of time. I want to see if you have a question, email us the question. Happy to answer that question. But I want to thank Tom. Tom, we've pushed a lot of content, have you talk about a lot of stuff in a little bit of time. I appreciate your comments today. And thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks, everybody.
And likewise, we wish people success as you develop your records and information management program and drive that in information governance.